To introduce Elizabeth Pertick and enjoy her talk, which again will be about 40 minutes with 5 minutes of questions. Thank you.
All right. Whoa, okay. It's going to be a little loud. I'll try not to shout into it. All right, this is also going to be your first taste of interdisciplinarity today, because my talk is going to be very different than Fred's. So I'm interested in the ways that we talk about technology. Specifically, the metaphors that people use to understand and describe their relationship with computer technology, how those metaphors came to be used in the first place, and how our understanding of them changes over time. I come at these questions from the perspective of the history of technology and science and technology studies, trying to uncover how the ways people talk about technology affects what technologies are built and how they're used. For example, I've previously worked on the history of the black box as a metaphor that developed within cybernetics as a way to understand the limits of human knowledge and how computer models might push those limits. Much of my work, however, has concerned the relationship between computer technology and disability. An earlier article I wrote examined the use of the metaphor of the curb cut, that ramp that goes from the sidewalk to the street, and its use by disability advocates to argue for the inclusion of accessibility features in personal computers. Today, I present my newest work on metaphors in the history of computer technology, on the idea of the computer as a prosthesis. This was recently published in, if I can toot my own horn a little bit, the fantastic new edited collection, Abstractions and Embodiments, New Histories of Computing and Society, edited by Janet Abate and Stephanie Dick. So if you want to know more about where the history of computing is going as a field, I highly recommend it. So, the computer is an intellectual prosthesis, an information prosthesis, a communication prosthesis. Variations on this metaphor show up throughout scholarship on the relationship between users and computer technology from many different fields of study: history, philosophy, science and technology studies, media studies, education, and more. The metaphor perhaps began with Seymour Papert in Sylvia Weir's 1978 paper, Information Prosthetics for the Handicapped, which suggested that the computer can become an extension of the operator, who can now do anything a computer can do, such as draw, compose music, gain access to information libraries, put text on permanent file, and so on. Notable figures in computer history have had the prosthesis metaphor applied to their understandings of computers and users. For example, Lev Manovich describes J.C.R. Licklider's idea behind man-computer symbiosis as an interactive digital computer can act as a kind of meta-prosthesis that augments our memory, perception, decision-making, and other cognitive operations. Likewise, Thierry Bardini explains that Douglas Engelbart's late 1960s computer interface with its mouse and cord keyset was based on the premise that computers would be able to perform as powerful prostheses, co-evolving with their users to enable new modes of creative thought, communication, and collaboration, providing they could be made to manipulate the symbols that human beings manipulate. With these and in other works, the metaphor usually goes unexplained, left to speak for itself in exactly what ways a computer can be a prosthesis for a human. What all these examples have in common is an attempt to describe the capability of the computer to augment human abilities. As Papert and Weir note in that first quote, possibly referencing Marshall McLuhan, the computer can be an extension of a person, expanding their abilities and senses. The computer as an extension explains why the prosthesis has been so widely latched onto as a metaphor, as it seems to provide a concrete, real-life example of what the computer is doing invisibly. We reach out via the computer, intellectually and with our senses, in a similar way as someone with a prosthetic arm reaches out to grasp an object. The prosthesis implies something like the opposite of an autonomous technology. It is integrated fully with the body, human and computer becoming one as the ultimate cybernetic organism. Prosthetic technology provides a technological way of enacting human autonomy, extending the body and senses while the user feels in control. Flipping the metaphor, in 1990, John Perry Barlow wrote of cyberspace that I don't know what to make of it, since as things stand right now, nothing could be more disembodied or insensate than the experience of cyberspace. It's like having had your everything amputated. The user is augmented by feeling like the body has been left behind entirely here, leaving the mind floating untethered online to do as one will. Employing these metaphors offers a way to get at what it feels like to use computers, to be able to do many things our bodies, including our minds, could not do without technology. Yet what is missing from nearly all of these examples of the metaphor is the people who actually use prosthetics, people with disabilities, and their reality of using technology to replace a part of the body. Within the confines of the metaphor, the computer as prosthesis misses out on bodily realities of actual prosthetic limbs. A prosthesis here is assumed to be a perfect fit when the computer is talked about as one, a way from the user to reach beyond their body. With this fantastical image of the prosthesis, it is perhaps unsurprising that when the metaphor is usually employed, it is not in consideration of computer users with disabilities, those who may use actual prostheses as they operate computers, along with those with other kinds of disabilities, also having their abilities augmented by the computer. Or, as Catherine Ott puts it, cyborg theorists who use the term prosthesis to describe cars and tennis rackets rarely consider the rehabilitative dimension of prosthetics, or the amputees who use them. The full complexity of what a prosthesis means is absent from its part in the metaphor. Further, to consider the subject literally, only a few recent works have looked at the relationship between computer technology and actual prosthetics, specifically attempts to impart a sense of touch to prosthetic devices using electronic technologies such as haptics. Instead, the prosthesis, and by extension disability, often remain nothing more than a metaphor. People with disabilities are rarely considered as computer users, and their place in computer history is not analyzed. The computer user is almost never one who wears a prosthesis in real life. They are instead able-bodied, and their prosthesis only a play on words, not a technology replacing an actual missing limb. When a marginalized group is treated this way as merely a metaphor, they become further erased from the history they were a part of. Disability studies scholars have published widely on the problems with using words and concepts related to disability as metaphors, particularly in literature and media. Carrie Sondhall argues, non-disabled artists in all media and genres have appropriated the disability experience to serve as a metaphor expressing their own outsider status, alienation, and alterity, not necessarily the social, economic, and political concerns of actual disabled people. Similarly to the prosthesis metaphor, other metaphors of disability rarely include actual people with disabilities, but are instead appropriated by non-disabled people to mark some outsider status. For example, Julie Avril-Minich explains about the overcoming narrative, where a disabled person heroically overcomes the hardship their disabilities pose, that pervasive disability representations like the overcoming narrative serve as metaphors for problems faced by able-bodied people, or to reinforce the marginalization of disabled people. These issues remain true for the prosthesis metaphor as well. Vivian Sobchak, who I'll return to later, suggests that an alternative approach to treating technology as prosthesis is to treat prosthesis as technology. This reversal opens the door to dig into the technologies that enable the computer to be a metaphorical prosthesis, those that allow access to it. All people require technologies of access to use the computer to its fullest. preferred input devices, ways of displaying information on the screen or through audio and other media, and various peripherals that allow us to enter something into the computer and receive something back. We all have different preferences and needs when it comes to the best ways to set up our computers for us to interact with them. This is all access, the technologies that connect us, body and mind, with computers. Thinking about human-computer interaction in this way leads to a shift in how we conceive of the interface, where the interface becomes the system of human and computer, along with all the various technologies the two need to communicate with each other. Not dissimilar from the idea of the computer as extension of human ability mentioned earlier. One way to understand these technologies is to center computer users with disabilities in the accessible technologies they use to operate the computer. This allows us to get at the diversity of bodies interacting with computers and what that might mean for the user-technology relationship. Frequently, when people with disabilities are mentioned as technology users, they are not talked about as normal users. Instead, they are a special case or a footnote to a standard history. Even scholarship focused on marginalized people and the relationship between different bodies and technology usually leaves out people with disabilities. Yet there is a rich history of people with disabilities and their families tinkering with and adapting technology to meet their needs. This is often done to make the built environment and consumer technology fit people who were not thought of as intended or normal users. People with disabilities have always been technology users. And by understanding how technologies have been made to work for people with different bodies and needs, we gain a more complete understanding of the relationship between technology and users in general. There is a well-known critique of the prosthesis metaphor from Jain, in which she argues that the metaphor itself falls apart as soon as you know anything about how prostheses work in reality. She suggests some necessary questions to be answered that are left out of the metaphor, such as which bodies are enabled and which are disabled by specific technologies. How is the normative configured? How does the use of the term prosthesis assume a disabled body in need of supplementation? How might the prosthesis produce the disability as a retroactive effect? Where and how is the disability located? And in whose interests are prostheses adopted? Without questions like these being addressed, the metaphor deflates without any real substance. Jain also brings in an issue I will return to later to not ignore the fact that technology, even metaphorical prostheses meant to augment human ability, also affect and change the body of the person using it. As Jain explains, wearing glasses adjusts vision, but also changes the comportment of the head and neck, and over years changes the contour of the muscular skeletal infrastructure. And the use of a 30-pound artificial leg strapped over the shoulder in the early century would have changed the weight distribution and physiology of the body. This is as true for computers as for these literal prostheses. As scholars have increasingly shown with all the forms of pain the computer has brought to the body. Hunched shoulders, carpal tunnel, and other repetitive stress injuries. Eye strain. These are all changes to our bodies that computer use has wrought in us. I would like to take a slightly different tack than Jain, however, by focusing on what we can learn about the relationship between people and computers when people with disabilities are foregrounded as technology users. Specifically, I argue that the prosthesis metaphor's focus on augmentation through embodied computer use can become a lens for critical analysis when we actually consider computer users with diverse bodies. By examining people with disabilities as normal computer users, we see not only the range of different bodies that must be made to fit with computer technology, but also the creativity and frustrations behind trying to accomplish such. Once fit is achieved, then possibilities for augmentation open up. And yet, that in itself is called into question in terms of what exactly about ourselves is being augmented by the computer. I find that we can keep something of the prosthesis metaphor in mind, and I'll return to this in my conclusion, by considering questions of fit between the bodies of users and the technologies that allow them to access the computer. Explicit consideration of the role of the body in interaction with and part of the computer interface is still uncommon in work studying human-computer interaction, although more scholars have recently been centering the body in this fashion. Doing so calls into question our understanding of exactly what the computer interface is and highlights the need to more fully understand the computer as an embodied technology. Today, I will examine 3 case studies of different computer technologies from the late 1970s to the 2000s that could be understood as augmenting human abilities. This is a period of significant change for the computer in society, but also for the place of people with disabilities in society. This period begins in a low point for the disability rights movement, with a lack of progress in gaining further civil rights protections after earlier victories in the 1970s, but then surges forward with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and all the successes and challenges that have come with it. People with disabilities over this time experienced far greater access to social participation, which included new forms of participation through computer technology and the growing internet. This increase in visibility and social presence also led to growing expectations among people with disabilities to no longer be just metaphorical outsiders. So, case 1, the unicorn keyboard. The unicorn keyboard was created in 1979 by a man named Steve Gensler in the Bay Area. It was perhaps the first widely used adaptive keyboard. Gensler invented this keyboard so that a friend of his with cerebral palsy could use an early personal computer. The keyboard consisted of 128 programmable switches that could be configured however the user wanted. This made the keyboard both simple in a way, but also significant for people with disabilities. Because it was completely programmable, once the switches were covered with an overlay that was divided into keys, it could contain however many keys the user wanted, each doing whatever they needed. An overlay could be put on top, replicating a typical computer keyboard and all of its keys. An overlay could contain just one key, covering all the switches that acted as a single switch input. Or the keyboard could be customized to be anything in between. This level of total customizability allowed the keyboard to be adapted to the user's abilities and needs. This adaptability of the unicorn keyboard made it a technology of augmentation in a way that allowed it to fit the body of the user, but also change with the user. This made it particularly useful as an educational tool for children with disabilities. A child could start with only 1 or 2 keys to learn cause and effect in the basics of how to operate a computer. From there, the overlays could be more complex to teach the child not only how to do more things with the computer, but also help them develop both cognitive and motor skills, making it an embodied technology in multiple ways as it worked with both the brain and body of the users. Shoshana Brand, you can see her here, was given one of the first unicorn keyboard prototypes when she was around 5 years old. Gensler had met Shoshana's father at a computer class at which both were trying to learn more about computer technology that might benefit people with disabilities in their lives. Shoshana was born with cerebral palsy and had vision impairments. Her parents, Jackie and Steve, hoped that the computer might help her learn to communicate. They got the unicorn keyboard working with their Apple II computer at first, and started by having the keyboard only contain one key that made the computer play music whenever Shoshana pressed anywhere on the overlay. This initial setup allowed her parents to determine Shoshana's abilities in terms of vision and motor control, while showing her that she could control basic cause and effect with a computer. She quickly advanced to pressing keys of different colors and animal pictures, the latter which would make the computer play animal sounds when she pressed a different kind of animal. As Jackie Brand describes her daughter using the keyboard, eventually the keys got smaller and smaller. There were more and more divisions on that board until she had essentially a full keyboard to work with. Had we shown her that full keyboard right at the beginning, there was no way she could have done it. It's like showing a very young child a standard keyboard and they go banging on it because they don't have the fine motor skills yet. And then they get bored and that's it. Instead, the computer became a real learning tool for her as it could develop and evolve on the keyboard as she developed and evolved, both in a physical sense and gained the fine motor skills, and also in a cognitive sense as she went through the developmental stages. The unicorn keyboard was able to fit Shoshana's body to a striking degree in both physical and cognitive ways. However, in spite of the promise of the keyboard, it still had to work alongside other technologies that might not fit as well. Her father, Steve Brand, bemoaned the fact that so much software at the time was based on assumptions that the user could see the screen well, providing only visual output and not accommodating users with vision impairments. A part of the computer in this case could augment people's abilities, but as an entire system, it was still lacking in accessibility. Another example of a unicorn keyboard user further illustrates how it could augment communication abilities. In 1992, a 15-year-old boy, Eric, with both hearing and vision impairments, used the unicorn keyboard to learn Braille as his vision decreased, in order to complement his communication in sign language. The keyboard was covered with an overlay of keys with raised dots on them, in order to get Eric used to feeling for the numbers of raised dots in Braille. He was then given tasks, such as to find and press a key with 3 dots, which would make the screen flash in response. Once he could correctly identify the number of dots on a key, an overlay with the partial Braille alphabet was introduced so that he could begin to learn the different letters in Braille. The keyboard could adapt to Eric's abilities and learning speed to effectively teach him a new form of communication that he would soon need to use as he lost the ability to communicate through sign language. While the unicorn keyboard held great potential to work with different people's bodies and abilities to allow them access to a computer, it also presented certain technical obstacles that needed to be overcome. In addition to the problems with inaccessible software, the keyboard could not communicate directly with a computer until later in the 1990s, instead requiring an expensive adaptive firmware card advertised for $520 in 1992 that would translate between the keyboard and computer. And this adaptive firmware card is a technology I'm currently working on to digging into the history of more and understanding its place in this relationship, so stay tuned for those developments. While this workaround became easier to use over time, the unicorn keyboard also required a significant level of technical expertise to set up and program the keys. A fact that people like the Brands, who realized its challenges but were also able to figure it out, lamented as preventing its wider use. The keyboard may have fit the body well, but only after a significant amount of work was put in to make it do so. Case 2 is the Macintosh GUI. My second case study concerns a computer technology not intended specifically for people with disabilities, but which significantly affected people with very different kinds of disabilities in different ways. And that is the graphical user interface, or GUI, of notably the Apple Macintosh. When the Apple Macintosh brought the GUI to a broad consumer audience in 1984, it carried with it new ways of interacting with personal computers, via a mouse and by clicking on icons, as opposed to entering text commands. This change, for the most part, fit users better. It was more user-friendly and easier to learn than text-based interfaces. However, it did not work well with all bodies, as the GUI carried assumptions with it that users could see the screen in order to navigate with a mouse. The GUI demonstrates how a technology can be embodied in very different ways for different people, so that for some, there are new possibilities for augmentation, and for others, a lack of access altogether. An example of how the GUI was beneficial for people with certain kinds of disabilities can be seen with Mike Matvey, a psychologist with learning disabilities that affected his ability to read and write. He went to a disability and technology resource center after getting a job that required him to be able to use a personal computer to write reports and professional materials and read patient records and office memos. In 1990, he detailed his experiences finding a computer that worked for him after being taught to use both the IBM PC and the Apple Macintosh. He explained that, and this is his original text with just the addition of spaces between the words added. And he said, "I could see why blind people would find IBM best for them. An IBM with voice output does not require visual skills. A person would need spelling skills, good memory for details, and ability to move through a system without visual references. I could also see why I was able to move through the Mac system with such speed and ease. It is built on a visual system, but it requires no spelling and very little reading to operate it. The few written words in the pull-down menus and dialog boxes are repeated identically in all applications. They are also kept within a pictorial context, which helps me know what the words are." So a text-based operating system, like the IBM had with MS-DOS, could accommodate the needs of blind users through specialized screen reader software. There were not extensive graphics available on such computers, and a keyboard was used as input. Whereas the Macintosh GUI could accommodate the abilities of someone like Matvey much better, with its limited use of text in menus, consistency across software design, and graphical representations in the form of icons. As more and more personal computers switched to GUIs in the 1990s, people like Matvey found an embodied relationship with computers that fit them well. However, blind computer users were increasingly denied access to new computers, as screen readers could not translate information on the GUI interface. There would eventually be a technological solution to this problem, but it would take until the late 1990s for screen readers to be able to work reliably with different GUI operating systems and commonly used software running on them. The GUI represents a way that one technology can have very different kinds of embodied relationships with users. For many people, the GUI fit them, accommodating their needs and generally being more user-friendly. But for others, there was a complete lack of fit, such that they were denied access to personal computers with GUIs altogether for a number of years. Who has access to a technology at all is based on assumptions of how people's bodies work in terms of how they control input and process output. When differences in bodies are not considered by developers, some people are left out of a relationship with the technology and its potential to augment abilities. My final case is the Diamond Touch. So this deals with the Diamond Touch tabletop device and children with autism as computer users and various kinds of software programs that were created for them. Researchers at the Mitsubishi Electric Research Laboratories developed the Diamond Touch in the early 2000s for collaborative work. And it quickly attracted attention from autism researchers and therapists. The images here are from a 2006 study to create interactive, cooperative video games for the table that children with autism could play to learn certain skills. And as you can see, the Diamond Touch, it's a touch-sensitive table, but it's not a screen, it's a projector above it that is projecting the image from the computer onto the table. Unusual for an input device, it allowed multiple users to interact with it at the same time. and could even distinguish between the touches of different individuals. This allowed, for example, for interactions that would require more than one person to act in concert to accomplish some goal, while also making it so that one user could not jump in and do a task assigned to someone else. This technology created a unique environment for embodied use, bringing multiple people into human-computer interaction at the same time. In 2009, a group of researchers created software for the Diamond Touch to help children with autism practice socialization skills. Their software, called Storytable, I'm sorry I don't have a picture of that one, they didn't have it in their studies, used the tabletop as an interface for collaborative narrative construction, in which two children took turns adding visual pieces to a larger story. So this could be things like they're basically constructing a creative story and they can add background images or objects to the story or images of different characters, things like that. So it becomes a visual story. The researchers found that this program encouraged the children to initiate social interactions with their peers and even showed some generalization of social skills beyond these controlled activities. The researchers also noticed another effect of the technology, a reduction in what they refer to as autistic behaviors, such as repetitive movements or stimming. From the researchers' perspective, they explain that stereotyped movements have been suggested to serve as a coping response. The extent to which they are performed is influenced, in fact, by how much an individual is affected by suboptimal stimuli in the environment. That is, by environmental settings that are perceived as either understimulating or overstimulating. Storytable apparently struck the right balance in terms of stimulation for its autistic users. There is an assumption here that such behaviors are inherently negative, a symptom of imbalance that the computer helps correct. As Meryl Alper has suggested, however, stimming is not necessarily a negative thing for autistic people. And she says many autistic people report that the repetition of physical movements or movement of objects helps them maintain emotional balance, regulates their senses, and provides pleasure. Computer technology, then, is capable of disciplining or regulating the body, and perhaps, to read this critically, even helping to make more acceptable bodies out of users. This could be a form of positive augmentation in achieving greater balance, or possibly a more detrimental form of control, depending on what is actually best for children to be doing with their own bodies. The Diamond Touch can be seen as a technology of augmentation, in the way that it was a tool through which cooperative socialization could be experienced. The children, as technology users, could interact with each other through and with the tabletop, controlling its virtual objects and text by touch. The tabletop was not only a communication system between the children, enabling the children to learn new skills as they operated it, but also helped them develop ones that they could take with them when not using it. It fit them and their abilities by being a computer technology they wanted to interact with. It was computer games that they got to play, and it also had an intuitive interface. But its embodied relationship extended further than just augmentation, also affecting bodily behavior seemingly external to its operation. In conclusion, these three case studies of computer users with disabilities operating different kinds of computer technologies demonstrate a way to get at issues of embodiment and augmentation by centering people with diverse bodies and abilities as users. Embodiment takes place through hands, eyes, ears, and brains, enabling relationships between humans and computers where cognitive, sensory, and perhaps even social abilities can be augmented. To return to the beginning then, can a computer ultimately be thought of as something like a prosthesis? Does this metaphor offer anything in attempting to understand the relationship between humans and computers and the possibilities for augmentation of human abilities? Don Idhe has criticized the prosthesis metaphor for missing out on the lived reality of prosthesis use, saying that the actual users of prosthetic devices know better. Prostheses are better than going without the tooth, the limb, the hand, but none have the degree of transparent total withdrawal of a tool totally embodied. All remain simply more permanently attached, ready-to-hand tools. Yet when one's body fails or is irreparably injured or parts of it are removed, the prosthesis becomes a viable and helpful compromise. A prosthesis replaces a missing or damaged body part to get as close as possible to the idea of the original or the idea of normal. To say that something is missing or damaged about the computer users in the examples I have given implies a wrongness in disabled bodies that needs to be corrected, and would imply the same for non-disabled computer users as well. The question is if this is the connotation we want to embrace to understand computer technology and human bodies. Yet an alternative way to use the metaphor may be possible if the body itself is explicitly centered in the analysis. The body then is not about perfectly transcending an inherently flawed body through the computer. Augmentation is possible, but it is never a straightforward relationship between such technologies and the bodies that use them. The case studies I have offered here exhibit the complexity of different bodies and the ways they are augmented or not by computer technologies. Vivian Sobchak, herself a prosthesis user, describes her own feelings toward her technological leg and other technologies that augment abilities, stating that, "I have not forgotten the limitations and finitude and naked capacities of my flesh, nor, more importantly, do I desire to escape them. They are, after all, what ground the concrete gravity and value of my life, and the very possibility of my partial transcendence of them through various perceptual technologies, be they my bifocals, my leg, or my computer." Bringing the body into focus offers a reminder of both its power and its flaws. Technologies of augmentation are not about trying to escape the body, but to go beyond what it can do on its own in certain small but significant ways. A way forward with the metaphor is suggested by Robert Rowden Wilson. In pushing the body-technology relationship with the metaphor, he argues that an appended body part not only recalls the previous, now missing organic part, but actively calls into question the body's integrity. This raises questions of the limits of the human body and the systems of human-computer interaction our bodies become part of. Wilson also calls for remembering the messiness of the body and what an amputation and prosthesis actually mean for people, where any consideration of prostheses has to take into account their potential failure and even the conditions under which they might go wrong or turn against their users. No prosthesis is a perfect fit, as is no metaphorical prosthesis. Tobin Siebers reminds us that when prostheses fit well, they still fit badly. They require the surface of the body to adjust. That is rarely easy and impart their own special wounds. A prosthesis is not about making its user superhuman. It grants abilities, but also rubs up against the body in harmful ways. We must broaden our understanding of the human-computer relationship to consider what we are without computers in our lives, with that augmentation missing. That might get us at questions of what the computer prosthesis is replacing within us. Further, if the computer can be a prosthesis, its negative effects on the body must be understood alongside its possibilities for augmentation. There is no single normal body for the computer user. For the diversity of bodies out there, computers are always an imperfect fit. As previously mentioned, they cause carpal tunnel, bad posture, headaches, and other problems. But they also allow us to do things with our bodies that we're incapable of otherwise, just like all technologies. They augment and allow us to go beyond what our bodies can do on their own, without ever leaving the body behind. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Could you just say a little more about how the ADA would apply to computer accessibility or website accessibility?
Yeah, there is kind of this trajectory of as computers become personal, enter the home, and become, more commonplace, it coincidentally maps onto people with disabilities also gaining further civil rights. So the main, actually, civil rights protection here was prior to the ADA. There's a law passed in 1988, usually abbreviated as the Tech Act, which provided a bunch of federal funding basically to create the kinds of resources centers that Michael Matvey went to, where people with disabilities could go and learn how to use different technologies and different accessible technologies that would enable them to use them. So that was kind of the first big move in terms of civil rights coming in and connecting with computer technology. But then you also had, you have, basically there's an overlap of the people involved here, and my book goes into this in more detail, but like Jackie Brand is also the assistant for one of the major disability activists in the Bay Area. So there's an overlap behind like the fight for disability rights in the 70s and these people then who would be focused on computer technology. Moshe.
Just as a quick comment that I think the very first use of this prosthesis metaphor was due to Leibniz, who when thinking, he conceived of the idea of the calculus ratiocinator. The reason calculus says, I don't remember the exact word, but the analogy will help the mind the same way looking glasses help the eyes. So he was the first to use the metaphor intelligence augmentation, essentially.
Yeah, I like that. I like going back to that, yeah. And that traces really nicely. It's interesting that he made an analogy with glasses there. Yeah, that's striking. Instead of going with, because I find it a little weird that a lot of the people who write about this metaphor with computers, they're talking about it like a prosthetic limb, which is kind of an odd way to think about a computer. Something like eyeglasses is kind of a more logical, I think, analogy there. Yeah.
And I immediately thought about it looking at you giving this talk using your eyeglasses,
yes,
of course.
Yes. And my tablet as my augmentation device, yes.
So I had a question, when you were kind of talking about the characteristics of what we'd consider technological prosthesis, some of those I found parallels when I was thinking about social media, for example. And I wondered if maybe you considered that as a technological prosthesis, because, for example, I've been seeing conversations, with the shifts in Twitter within the disability community about how it, really provided a platform for people to engage with each other and gave a voice that maybe they didn't necessarily have to the same degree. So I'm just very curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, social media is interesting. Yeah, you're absolutely right about Twitter. Like, as much as it's a trash fire, it's been really helpful for disability studies and disability activism. So yeah, and I think Zoom is a nice comparison here too. We can think about when COVID hit and the way that we all transitioned to doing everything through Zoom. We could try to understand that through a metaphor like the prosthesis, of it acting as a prosthesis for essentially in-person interaction. And social media then could be similar. And then it brings in all the problems as well. And I think the focusing on the problems is the right way to take the metaphor. So if we think about with Zoom, the network connectivity problems that made it hard to use, the fact that now you're doing something like attending a class, but with the possibilities of much greater eye strain because you're staring at a screen all the time. So the fact that it took Zoom like 2 years to have built-in captions, So there's ways that if we look at the problems, we can complicate the idea of it as a prosthesis, that it wasn't a perfect fit. It wasn't a perfect replacement. It was the best we could do at the time. Yeah. Thank you very much.